When I listen to solid state gear, it does seem to have a characteristic sound, which is a bit of a bump in the response in the lower treble. It seems a little more heart brighter than life is, and I'm wondering whether that's the contribution of the higher order, odd order harmonics that we've been talking about. I don't hear this in tube gear. Now, tubes, and I'm not going to say tubes are perfect. Absolutely not. I mean, triodes, they are very clean sounding, uh, and they have to be run Class A. Again, when you pentodes are a different animal. They operate under what's called a square law function, and they still generate, for the most part, odd order harmonics. But in some amplifiers, you will start seeing, or pardon me, I'm getting mixed up now. Uh, Pentodes will generate some odd order harmonics, usually just third. And again, that can be reduced by the design of the amplifier. But pentodes, being square law devices, they tend to generate a larger number of even order harmonics. So you'll have second, fourth, eighth, so on order harmonics. So they're not quite as clean as triodes, which is why you see a lot of amplifiers that'll have a switch between triode and ultralinear mode or some other thing. It's why for the most part, you will only see triodes in preamplifiers. It's just they're gonna have the lowest distortion period, unless whoever it is. Now pentodes have more gain, and you can connect a pentode up as a triode, make it act exactly like a triode, but still retain a bit more gain. So you can have the best of both worlds there. Now, there is a solid state, I'm not going to say equivalent, but a device, solid state device that acts very close to pentodes are field effect transistors. Your small signal FETs, which are what you mainly see in solid state preamplifiers and at the input of solid state amplifiers, the input section, and then MOSFETs, which, as you know, are widely used now in power amplifiers as the output devices because they have a lot of benefits. They're rugged. They're not as prone to thermal runaway as bipolars are, to my knowledge. And they again have that square law distortion characteristic, which is essentially predominantly even order harmonics. So this tends to give them a warm quality when you listen to them compared to bipolar transistors. And if someone tells you that all amplifiers sound alike, I think they need to do a little more listening. Now they'll probably say, "Oh, put them up in an A/B test." Okay. And here's, I guess I'm going to get more people mad at me here, but unless an A/B test is conducted very conservatively, the number of variables in the test will swamp the effect you're trying to listen for. So here goes a story. I may have mentioned before I worked at Sunfire, Bob Carver's last big corporation that he ran. He currently is running a smaller operation where he's doing what he loves, building tube gear and speakers. But at Sunfire, he had he did have a full model line for the most part, everything but a source product. But when he started Sunfire, a lot of the products were his labor of love, and one of them was the classic tube preamp. I'll post a picture. Oh boy, another Sunfire story, they say. But Bob had the classic tube preamp, and me being young and headstrong and thinking I knew better than everyone said, well, Bob, we ought to, you've got a pretty basic power supply on this. Why don't we put a regulated supply on it, like Audio Research and some of the other people do? And he said, I don't think it's audible. And he said, and so I was encouraged to build a prototype with a regulated power supply, which I did. And I basically just put I think I put a 3-pin regulator on a Zener string and floated it up at 210 volts, somewhere around there. It may have just been a pass MOSFET up there. I forget exactly how I implemented it. But it's easy enough to put a regulator on the heater supply, but a little harder to do it on the high voltage circuit because, your average LM317 or other 3-pin regulator IC is not going to fare very well up at 200 volts unless you take a lot of precautions. But anyway, I came up with this thing. I built a preamp that had this thing in it and was listening to it, and everything seemed to be, tested it, everything seemed to be good. And Bob said, okay, let's do an A/B test. So we went into this, they had a small sound room off the engineering wing there. And Bob had a pair of his amazing loudspeakers. He had a Sunfire amplifier, and he was running the Amazings in a bi-wire situation where he's coming off the current source outputs on the Sunfire amplifier as well as the voltage source outputs on the Sunfire amp. And if you're not familiar with Sunfire, God, this is going to be a long video. I apologize. But if you're not familiar with the Sunfire amp, it has the standard output of the amplifier is the voltage source outputs. It's what is akin to the output of most other Class AB amplifiers. Bob also had a neat little trick he did for them to emulate the high output impedance of a single-ended triode amp. That's one thing he mentioned a lot in the ad copy for the Sunfire amp when he came out with it. Is as the heart and soul of a 9-watt triode single-ended amplifier. And the way he did that was there were 2 large resistors. I hope I'm not giving away any trade secrets here, but there were 2 large resistors on the output of the amplifier, which raised its output impedance. And what that does is it reduces the ability of the amplifier to control the speaker that it's powering. It kind of decouples the speaker. And so the speaker's kind of, I could say a terrible thing. Oh, I never turned that on. There we go. That might help a little. But the speaker tends to kind of flap in the breeze a bit rather than being under rigid control by the amplifier as it would if it were hooked up to the voltage source outputs. So here already, and it gives you a fatter, warmer sound, which is kind of the opposite of the detailed sound you want when you're trying to discern tiny differences between your preamp source running a conventional supply and running a regulated power supply. So we're doing this A/B test, and there were about 4 or 5 of us, and everyone was listening, and only one person claimed to hear a difference, and but he wouldn't commit to it. That was Vic, our engineer. And come to find out, I was really frustrated, so I took the thing home and was listening to the regulated prototype. Come to find out, the regulated prototype had a bad input selector switch. So bad it would scratch and when you wiggled it, and it would make diodic distortion of the sound. And for some reason, we didn't even hear that in the A/B test. And part of the what I want you to take away from this is, for me, listening in that situation, I'd never heard anything in that room before, never had heard the amazing loudspeakers before, never listened much to a Sunfire on the current source outputs. So there were all these variables thrown in the mix, and I was supposed to hear this tiny difference between the regulated and not regulated. And of course, no one could. Which, where I'm going with that is, if you're going to do A/B tests, use a known environment, known gear, change one thing at a time, and hopefully maybe you'll hear a difference. So why I like tubes is I don't know whether it's the absence of that bright peak and upper harmonic hash that you get in solid state, whether it's just the benefit of running a simple circuit and a device that may not even require negative feedback to sound good. Now, interestingly enough, Nelson Pass has been working on the solid state side of this. He's using JFET, current source JFET buffers as preamps that have a very minimal sonic signature. And also he's using Class A, sometimes single-ended MOSFET amplifiers. Very simple circuits in his pass and first watt designs. And as a result, they tend to sound remarkably clean and detailed and uncolored. So this is what I like about tubes, is they tend to have a more natural sound to my ears. They're generally, you have more soundstage depth, although, again, Nelson Pass found that is a characteristic of second harmonic. If you have in-phase second harmonic distortion, it tends to put the vocalist out in front of the speakers and in your face. If you have out-of-phase second harmonic distortion, it tends to move the vocalist back behind the speakers. So you get that deep darks or deep recess sound stage. And I may have mentioned that's what you hear on the B1 preamp. The sound stage is completely behind the speakers. However, if I played my Van Alstyne Pass preamp, I would put the vocalist right in the plane of speakers, if not ahead. So, what I'm trying to say, I like tubes. I feel that tubes are something we should look at and consider as one. We shouldn't just throw it out as being, evil high distortion dinosaurs from the past. We need to look at them as an alternative method to, an alternative ingredient in this audio stew we're trying to make for, as we all journey towards our realization of what the perfect sound would be for us. And like I said, I'm a firm believer in some kind of hybrid synthesis. This preamp shows kind of what I'm talking about. I mean, here you can see regulated power supplies, fully solid state. You know, the tubes have these current sources, or basically acting as active plate loads, and this linearizes the tube. And this thing does sound quite detailed, and despite its deep, dark, gloomy character. So, again, I feel if you're curious about tubes, yeah, you can go out and buy a Dyna Stereo 70 or whatever, but I would say look into an affordable tube preamp solution. You might look at a Dynaco Pass preamp and upgrade it. And there are 10 companies out there who make mod gear for the Dynaco preamp. You might be lucky if you're willing to spend a little more. You might find a reasonably decent audiophile preamp. You saw I did a previous video on the Audio Research LS1 line stage that I got, and I'm getting a little hoarse here. That's an excellent sounding product. I've had a few issues with it, and hopefully we'll get those worked out. But again, there is treasure and terror on eBay, so be wise. If someone if you live in a large metropolitan area, there may be a store that has a used gear room. We're very lucky that Seattle has Hawthorne, and they have a used equipment room, and you can go there and pick up gear for about half what it would cost new, which is great. So, again, one of the things I want to say is, you know, be willing to consider tube preamp, solid state amp. If you like a brighter sound, you may want to stick with bipolars. If you're looking for something that's warm, you may want to look at a MOSFET amp. And if you're looking, in the bargain range, I would highly recommend you look at used ADCOM amplifiers. The ADCOM amps, the 5200, 5400, and 5500, and the 5800 are all excellent MOSFET amps that have had design input from Nelson Pass, among others. And you probably pick up a 5200 for $200, and it's not old enough that it should need a lot of work. It's a newer design. I don't think it's prone to some of the capacitor issues that the older ADCOMs experience. But even then, you pick an old ADCOM up for $100, change the caps out for 50, you still have a great amp. But the older ones from the 80s tend to be exclusively bipolar. It wasn't until the 90s that they came out with the MOSFET amps. So I've mentioned a lot of components add to the flavor of the stew, and I'm not going to say every part is audible, but there are a lot of things that are. Capacitors especially, because in a lot of cases the signal is going through a coupling capacitor, and if it's going through a mediocre electrolytic cap, again, it may be experiencing dielectric absorption and other audio nasties affecting the quality of the signal. And again, your your amplifier or preamplifier may measure great, but still sound a little gritty and harsh and raspy, and you're not sure why. One thing you can do if you have a decent respected bit of gear, you might find that you could upgrade capacitors to film types and make a difference in sound. One of the first units I built for myself when I was at Sunfire is I got a older Generation 1 Sunfire and installed a toroidal transformer from one of the 17-inch amps, and then went through it and upgraded all the capacitors, and it sounded marvelous. Also, when I went to newer, faster op amps in it, that improved it.